I'd like to open the floor to some questions. We have a couple of them here, but I would like to encourage you to raise your hand or indeed just put a question into the Q&A, and then we can proceed. But I'll start with a couple of questions. One thing that I find really frustrating, I suppose, as a scientist, and I think Matt pointed to this, that the science policy divide. We have, the science might be clear on the risks. It might even be clear on what the best mitigation solutions might be, or longer term risk reduction opportunities that can take 10 years. It could take 50 years. It can take 100. The science for climate change, some might argue, has been around for probably close to 50 years now anyway, and we're still struggling with that. So I wonder if any of you might like to comment on what you see as the biggest challenge in making the, what from a scientific point of view, we might say the science is clear, but from a policy or direct action point of view, it's a battle. So what do you see as the biggest factors in making things happen on the ground? Anybody want to answer that?
Maybe I'll start from the policy perspective. I think one of the interim pieces, one of the little islands that you can put in between that science policy divide, probably comes down to having a full policy larder of potential actions. And so we know from the social scientific literature that after major disaster events, called those focusing events, that there's a fairly brief period of time in which transformative or major policy actions can take place. And a lot of that has to do with political and public attention. And so the trick, though, is that you need to have the solutions ready to go when those opportunities present themselves. And so that integration of work between the scientific community and the policy community has to take place outside of the crisis period so that you can sufficiently exploit the crisis period when it comes with good evidence-based action. And I think sometimes getting the attention of the public, of the policy side of the divide is challenging in those periods. So anyway, that's just one kind of reflection that we have, is making sure that we know the solutions and that we're sort of waiting with them ready to go for when the opportunities really do present themselves, which unfortunately is increasingly frequent given all the disaster increases that we've seen in recent years.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I'll add on to what Matt said and totally agree with what you said, Matt. Building on that, in the flood area, we call that flood amnesia, where you have a little window to make some policy change or get some action done, and that's absolutely a challenge. So I think it gets down to that ability to prioritize those projects and having a consistent methodology. So one of the tools that I talked about was the National Risk Index, and that helps. That type of tool, and I know there are others out there, can help in the risk communication piece as well as prioritizing investments. We find, we get a lot of money for investing in grants and other for multi-hazard peril, but it's not enough, right? So even though we get billions, I mean, there's still billions to invest in mitigation. So having a good way to prioritize those investments is important. And then, finally, the last piece I would say is one of the biggest challenges is risk communication and behavioral change. I get we have the National Flood Insurance Program that you all may know about. Not enough people insured for flood, and constantly get letters, from individuals or communities. Hey, I've lived here for 30 years and I haven't seen it flood, or I don't believe. Why are you making me get flood insurance? I don't believe it's going to happen to me, and that effect. And beating people over the head with data isn't the solution that we found, but we're still looking for that effective risk communication process to convince people that no, it can happen to you, and tools like the risk index and other things can help with that messaging too.
Thanks, Mike. Malika, are you able to
Yes.
unmute? Yeah, great. Thanks,
Thanks,
Malika.
John. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly build on what Mike said about flood amnesia and apply that to the Canadian experience where, within people's lived experience, for example, we haven't had a major earthquake. So people's perception of that risk, I would say particularly in Eastern Canada, is quite low. There's an awareness in Western Canada. However, Eastern Canada, that's quite low. So building that awareness is a challenge. And we do have the knowledge across all of this. We have the knowledge to improve, to retrofit our building stock, but it's competing priorities and resources too. So that apples to apples comparison that I think kind of both Matt and Mike touched on is key in understanding where we target mitigation dollars and what we do with existing at-risk building stock.
So maybe I could just follow up a little bit with that issue of the making the investment. So I think as risk in the risk assessment space, we spend a lot of time and energy assessing risk, essentially describing the disaster scenario, you might say, and trying to raise awareness of that. But I think it's, perhaps only relatively recently that we've been able to start really using the risk assessment tools to inform the investment process. So informing, it's nice to say, yeah, we should retrofit buildings, but which ones? How, do we do that versus put up flood barriers? Do we move populations? All these sorts of things. Now, I wonder if you could comment on the, where perhaps the science and technology could be improving in that space, say going beyond the indicators to what, might be more solutions oriented, and perhaps what your own organizations might be doing in those regards. Thanks.
Sure, I'll let's see, try to start. So I mentioned the risk communication piece. I think there's also, hopefully this gets to your question too, some prioritization, but capacity and capability is also a big issue for us with communities, and particularly with disadvantaged communities or underserved communities. That in our process right now, we're looking at, so how do we use these tools, and I'll keep going back to the risk index because it has social vulnerability in there, to, often underserved communities don't have access to a computer. So they're not going to be able to get on and look at their risk index. So rather than having when we go out to visit a community or a tribal nation, we can't have the same process to communicate risk and deliver our programs. So we're looking to customize our technical assistance in ways that meet those communities or tribal nations, where they're at, so we can deliver our programs more effectively and try to build that capability with them, because it's really a long-term endeavor. It's not a, each year we have our grant application period, but you've got to build that capability as well. So we're taking a look at our programs, whether it's the technical side of things or the delivery of grants, and even adjusting some of our policies on how we approach things differently in underserved communities. I see there is a question about indigenous relations, and I'm going to drop something in the chat, hopefully I'll do it correctly, but about our just released our national tribal strategy that folks could look over, and hopefully that'll be responsive.
Thanks, Mike. Would Matt or Malika like to address Malika?
Yeah, thanks, John. I can jump in, and I think it's a piece you well know in the earthquake space, where we are able to report against what building types, where what construction and what use are most at risk, so that a prioritized mitigation strategy can be employed. It provides a starting point, and it's been successfully employed in the city of Vancouver, for example. But without that prioritization, what is most vulnerable? I think it's hard to look at your entire building stock and think, where do I start? I think we provide a starting point by being able to report against those indicators. I want to speak to a question in the chat that asked about equity and vulnerability. And just to say that one of the foundations of our risk models is a social vulnerability index that looks at things like demographics, social agency, how secure folks' housing is. And so allows us to understand, among other indicators, that allows us to understand who, what, and where are most at risk. So yes, there certainly is a dimension of equity in our risk work.
I think I'll just build really briefly off both Michael and Malika's points, if that's okay. The first thing from our perspective is that the science has come a long way, just even in the last 5 years in Canada, particularly related to flooding. I know on the seismic side, it's been more mature in terms of really targeting the highest risk areas. We're just getting to that place now with flood risk. And so we're able to say of the buildings, from a probabilistic perspective, these are the ones that are the most at risk. And then, as Malika said, on the equity side, overlaying that social vulnerability index allows us to then go in and tailor make certain products. So in the case of our flood insurance proposal, we can go in and identify within specific neighborhoods, not just that there is low social resilience, but also why. And so that enables us to actually make much more targeted interventions in collaboration with local governments. So we think that that's a big step forward, although we're really just only at the beginning of that. The other piece that I would just build off of that Michael mentioned is we had 2 or 3 national risk assessment projects that got all the way up to the political level and sort of died on the vine. And I think a lot of the reason for that was we couldn't figure out how to transform the risk assessment into actionable intelligence for decision makers. And that's where, in addition to that targeted building stock information that's so important, it's also really important to understand the emergency management capabilities that exist and that are required to deal with those specific scenarios or those specific probabilistic risks. And so taking that additional step of something which is more qualitative that tells you about, for this particular hazard in this particular community, what is required from the community to prevent and mitigate, to prepare for, respond to, and recover from that event, and then being able to work with the community to identify their existing capability set so that you can have evidence-based capability gaps. That becomes a lot more politically interesting, at least from our recent experience, to elected officials, and helps us to get over some of the challenges in there looking at kind of a relative ranking of hazard scenarios and not understanding what to do with that.
Thanks very much for those. I guess I wanted to make one other perhaps observation maybe you could comment on. So, for instance, we are as a community, reasonably good at estimating impact and the immediate cost, but it's often perhaps the intangible or indirect costs that are not only difficult to estimate, but are at the same time perhaps the ones that actually perhaps should be more considered in informing those actions. So the direct cost of say damage from an earthquake is often not enough to justify mitigation on a purely cost-benefit basis because of the rarity of events. But other factors suggest that a devastating event, whether it be an earthquake or a flood or what have you, would be so catastrophic that you simply can't ignore it, even if it's rare. Maybe you could comment on that. And then there are some other questions here in the chat I'd like to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would say, just having been looking at this the last couple of years, is we still don't have a good ex ante methodology for estimating what those second order or third order impacts are going to be. So part of the issue that we have is still kind of a technical issue in that we have a hard time quantifying those things in advance. After major events, after the dust is settled, we've had some success in going in and doing case studies after the fact. and getting a better sense of the broader socioeconomic impacts of those events. And as you alluded to, John, I mean, the costs are 2-3 times more than what the direct impacts are, and sometimes higher than that. And so that gives us a sense. I think that starts to give us a little bit of a way of communicating those other impacts. But I think that there still is a bit of a technical challenge in space for some additional methodological development to help us really do a better job up front of baking those into the calculations so that we can make the strongest possible cost benefit case that we can.
I think Hazas was a pioneer in indirect loss estimation. So Mike, perhaps like to hear from you on your, how is that evolving in your case?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, to build on what Matt just said, that yeah, certainly, our approach and methodology for limited number of hazards is using Hazas. We've also looked at losses avoided for different hazards, and with the National Institute of Building Science, and published some reports. I'm having trouble dropping links into the chat, so I'm not sure what's going on there, but I would drop a few links in there. But where we've built for whether it's earthquake or flood or pick the hazard, but for the dollar investments, X number of dollars in return, and you see things such as adoption of building codes with an $11 return, and floods, I think, at like $7 or $8. So using those types of tools also to demonstrate that cost effectiveness. I'll see if I can drop that link in there as well. The other question that I noticed that I'm trying to catch up on all the chat here. Is updates on Hazas, because that has the annualized losses and the social vulnerability piece. So getting back to the previous question as well, we're shooting to update that annually to include the territories in Puerto Rico as well. Hopefully, I want to say coming this spring. The trailer is ahead of time, but yeah, so NRI has us capturing those indirect losses, and then losses avoided studies, and for losses avoided studies going out on individual disasters to demonstrate the investments that we've provided in communities, and what would have happened if those investments had not been made.
John, I'd like to jump back to your question about indirect costs, and just add that, I mean, the pandemic, if nothing else, has made it so starkly clear, to everybody in the world what indirect losses are, something that probably wasn't in most people's consciousness prior. And now we all know the incredible potential indirect losses from events. So I think just that knowledge and awareness alone is a big education piece that makes it easier to comprehend and build in.
Okay, thanks, Malika. As an interesting question here, how accurately does the output of loss estimation models need to be, for example, within a factor of 5, an order of magnitude? I mean, this question by itself, I think it's hard to answer, but it does indicate that obviously there's obviously a lot of uncertainty in how we in estimating risk, and certainly this contributes to the difficulty in making making decisions. So I wonder if any of you would like to address the question about uncertainty, and how good does the answer have to be to make, maybe give a couple examples of where this has been a factor, and how you've addressed it in your processes.
I can talk about uncertainty in terms of our flood program that I mentioned during the presentation. We produce this binary product, this in and out flood map, that has a great deal of precision. It can be based on LiDAR, hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, etc. But it's this binary 100-year flood, and you're either in or you're out, and and we don't deal with uncertainty around that line. So we're trying to switch to a probabilistic modeling approach, a graduated risk, so it might look more like a heat map, so that we can communicate There's much more frequent floods that happen that you have to be aware of, like in an urban setting, for example, and there's much rarer floods that happen. So if you're outside the 100-year line, you're still at risk. We like to say where it can rain, it can flood. So buy insurance and be aware. And I see we're getting the cue to wrap up, so I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think we've got just a minute. Any additional remarks on that, and then I'll make a couple of comments to close.
Maybe just really briefly, this is something that we have a lot of ongoing, I would say, tension with our hydrometeorological service on, because we're very good at looking at and worrying about uncertainty on one side of the equation. But the opposite side of the equation is people are making investment decisions and development decisions now with no consideration whatsoever for hazards. So I would take a significant amount of uncertainty, but making some form of evidence-based decision making, at least considering the hazards, over what's currently happening with just completely not considering it at all. So I think my tolerance for uncertainty in these probabilistic models is pretty high, because otherwise it's 100% uncertain and people are developing in places that we really ought to know should not be developed.
Matt, I love your answer. As a risk modeler, you know, this is, we deal with it all the time. So it's, but I think I suppose translating that uncertainty into still a call for action is one of our big challenges. So I'd like to thank, I wish we had more time. Actually, I thought we did have more time, but now I'm told we're done. So with that, though, I would like to very much thank you for your participation. This was really great start to the conference, and I'd love to follow up with more questions with all of you at some point. But with that, I'll turn it back to Sonia, who's going to introduce the next session and speakers.